Hi, everybody. It's Dr. Z here. Welcome to the last part 4 of the Age of Nationalism. We're going to talk about France, the Dreyfus Affair, and the Crimean War. Here we go. So, as a little refresher, when we talked about the Industrial Revolution, we learned that the Industrial Revolution helped make peasants into Frenchmen. Right? This was the Weber's thesis of his book by that name, Peasants into Frenchmen. The railroads, conscription, education, all led to people feeling French, right? Because in France, their nationalism is sort of flipped as it is for Germany, right? Another historian says that France was a state in search of a nation, right? When we talked about Germany, we talked about a nation in search of a state. So what does this mean, a state in search of a nation? Well, they already had state infrastructure. They had borders, a unified government. They had they understood who they were. They, were not divided people in the sense of their bureaucracy, right? Napoleon fixed all that. Napoleon was very bureaucratic. And even if you think back to some of the reforms of Louis XIV, right, in creating all the departments and everything like that, France was a bureaucratic state, right? It had a state. Very much. It didn't need a Zollverein. It didn't need a unification governmentally. It had a unified government. But did the people feel French, right? And so Weber would say, no, not yet, right? But that through the 19th century, that is happening, right? Mainly because of the Industrial Revolution. But the big question is, who gets to be French? Because in the late 19th century, a major event happens called the Dreyfus Affair. And the story goes like this. So there's a Alsatian Jewish army officer named Alfred Dreyfus. He's a captain. And he is accused of selling military secrets to the Germans during the Franco-Prussian War. He goes on trial. And the people of France are following this in the newspapers. And this trial really becomes a litmus test for xenophobia, which is the fear of foreigners in France, and of course for anti-Semitism. Dreyfus is publicly stripped of his honors. You can see on the right-hand side here, where French army officer is, taking all of his regalia off and stomping on it on the ground. This is the captain here, standing here without his regalia, and there's the regalia on the ground. And he was sentenced as a traitor, sentenced to solitary confinement to Devil's Island in South America. And this, basically, everybody was, we call this an affair because everybody's paying attention to it, right? Everyone's reading about it in the newspaper. And as the story unfolds, the press discovered that Dreyfus's superiors illegally falsified documents in order to secure a conviction. So the nation becomes completely divided. And this is why we say it's a litmus test for xenophobia, right? Because there's Dreyfusards on the left and anti-Dreyfusards on the right, right? Dreyfusards, people who support him, right? And obviously anti-Dreyfusards, people who think that he should be convicted. Eventually, he gets exonerated and pardoned, okay, like 7 years later. But what do we make of all of this, right? We see that there is an ability of an individual to seek redress against injustice. Okay, right? It's a story of conviction, right? And holding fast to your beliefs. We also see the transformation of the nature of the French political life, right? The importance of the mass press and the lesser importance of parliamentary politics, because people were just totally taken up by the story, right? But then we come to that question that I asked you in the beginning, who gets to be French, right? And so this is starting to have us ask, right, who gets to be part of this new republic? And Émile Zola, remember him from Germinal? He wrote an article in the newspaper titled, I Accuse, supporting Dreyfus. This was published in Clemenceau's paper. Zola was exiled for libel as a result, but the letter did help Dreyfus get exonerated in the end. Why is this important? we're moving into our next chapter, which is the West in the world. It's all about new imperialism. And then we'll be moving into the 20th century, where issues of identity and who gets to be a member of a nation really come into play. The other big takeaway I want you to see is this is one more touch point in the story and the history of anti-Semitism, leading us to the Holocaust, right? If you learned anything from AP Euro, right, the Nazis did not invent anti-Semitism. There's a long history of European anti-Semitism, right? And this is one touch point along the way of it. So in that sense of, right, who's included, right? We asked this when we talked about the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, for example, right? This is one touch point in that. Switching gears, let's talk a little bit about the Crimean War. The Crimean Peninsula is in the Black Sea. It was part of Ukraine. Right now it's part of Russia. And it's definitely a contested piece of land, okay? With the main city there being Sevastopol. Okay, there's the Crimean Peninsula. And you'll notice here's the territories of the Russian Empire right today, right? As we recognize, right, a lot of this is being heavily contested with the Ukraine and Russian war. What is this war all about? So there's the Congress of Vienna, right, is in some ways, it's the balance of power that they're trying to establish is breaking down, right? Through those revolutions, through the Franco-Prussian War, through the establishment of nations and nationalism and democracies and republics and things like that, right? So the balance of power in the Congress of Vienna it's really breaking down by the end of the 19th century. The great powers are clamoring for dominance then, therefore, in the Middle East. And as we will understand that clamoring a lot more in the next chapter on new imperialism. So Russia wanted to expand into Ottoman territory. And the Ottomans, of course, had lost some of their territory. We remember the Greeks, for example, in the early 19th century. The Russians were promoting Eastern Orthodox Christianity over Roman Catholicism. And they also, saw the decline of the Ottoman Empire and the unwillingness of Britain and France to allow Russia to gain any territory or power at Ottoman expense. And so, Russia is sort of exerting its dominance in this way. And so our sides, we have Russia versus a coalition. And the coalition includes the Ottomans, the British, the Sardinians, and the French forces. And Russia loses the Crimean War. Nicholas II is the Tsar of Russia. He issued an ultimatum saying, all Orthodox subjects of the Ottoman Empire are now placed under my protection. So Britain and France then promised to support the Ottomans in their sovereignty, right? Saw this as an affront to sovereignty and to nationalism. Irony of ironies, right? Because Britain's the one who helps the Greeks get independence from the Ottomans. But anyways, so therefore the Ottomans then declare war on Russia. There's fighting in the Balkans. Balkan Peninsula is that peninsula where from Bulgaria and Serbia to Greece and Macedonia and Croatia. And so I want you to understand, a lot of students in your age group confuse the Baltics in the north, like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, with the Balkans in the south. So, geographically, let's get that one straight. And so the fighting occurred around the Balkans, and there was an 11-month battle for the city of Sevastopol. And this was the most significant part of the war. And during this, by the way, there were telecommunications between, so they were using Morse code and telegraph to send dispatches. British forces were sending dispatches back to London. So people were reading about the war in almost real time. Like they knew what happened yesterday at the war, which was like a first time that this happened. You can kind of compare it to when people started watching the Vietnam War on television for the first time and sort of seeing the war happen in real life. They were reading about it in real time. And that was really significant. So after this battle, the Russians sued for peace in March of 1856, and they could no longer have warships in the Black Sea. So this war is significant because of all the technology, the telegraphs we talked about, but also railways, which helped everyone get to the front, Russians included, and naval shells, right? And what did we learn? So the Russians said, we need more tech. We need better railroads. We need better arms. We need better military reform, right? And if we're going to head towards World War I, right, because we have the benefit of hindsight, we know that that's coming. The Russians are definitely going to feel like they don't have the technology by that point. And then the next Tsar, Alexander II, as a result, abolished his serfdom, okay, in the face of Russian weakness. So we're going to talk about this more, not on the next slide. That's a mistake. It's actually going to be when we start talking about World War I, we're going to do the Russian Revolution. We'll talk more about that as we get there. And then, of course, one of the lasting figures of the war is Florence Nightingale. She's a famous nurse who gains worldwide attention with the treatment of wounds and modern nursing. So, as I said, Russian Revolution is going to come in the World War I unit. This is the end of this chapter for now. Next chapter, we will be going into the new imperialism of the late 19th century. Okay, thank you. Bye all.